Hello and welcome to Market Values, the Transfermarkt podcast that tells you which players are going up and which players are going down in value by discussing the biggest stories in the sport each and every week. We have some huge stories that we want to talk about this week. We go to France, where I speak to my colleague Rono about some of the biggest stories in Ligue 1, a certain defender who's making his way to Liverpool, and of course a Real Madrid striker who is rebounding at Lyon. And then as well as that, I also speak to my colleague Ben about 3 Premier League players who could see their market values change quite dramatically between now and the end of the season. But before we get to any of that, Manu, we are here. Here in the UK, it is close to midnight because we are instantly reacting to the World Cup qualifiers, which obviously saw a number of big hitters miss out on this summer's World Cup. Poland got knocked out by Sweden, Denmark got knocked out by the Czech Republic, and Italy, most dramatically, were knocked out by Bosnia. That's made a huge change, Manu, to what was previously the top 10 list of MVPs who will miss this World Cup. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new entrants in the top 10. Before we get to that though, hello, how are you? Nice to see you. And yeah, what did you make of the results tonight and who's going to this year's World Cup?
Yeah, I think everyone baffled by what happened in Bosnia. Remarkable story for them. Really happy for Edin Dzeko. I think it was his lifelong ambition to go to a World Cup. He's going to go there at the tender age of 40. So good for him. But still, I mean, Italy, 3rd time in a row now that they haven't reached a World Cup. It's the first time in the history of the World Cup that a multiple winner has missed out in 3 tournaments in a row. I think that is a remarkable story in itself. I think there's going to be probably even more soul-searching for Italian football, a country that's already in crisis. We had Marius on last week, right? Talking about the lack of young talent coming through and how remarkable the rise of Pio Esposito has been and how that he's really just a player on his own standing out now because there's so few young and talented Italian players coming out. And I guess that is really the symptom, isn't it, of this disease that's currently plaguing Italian football, that there's just not enough young players, and it's showing with the results and the lack of qualifying for major tournaments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we take a look at the top 10 most valuable players who won't make it to this tournament, and if you're watching this on YouTube or Spotify, of course, you'll see this list. But for people listening at home or maybe on their drive to work or maybe on a jog or however you like to listen to the show, I'll quickly run through the top 10. We have Federico Di Marco, the Italian, whose market value is 50 million euros at number 10. He's actually joined in market value by Rasmus Højlund, the Danish striker, and Riccardo Calafiori, the Arsenal left-back. They're all on 50 million euros. Benjamin Sesko, the Slovakian striker, on 65 million euros. Alessandro Bastoni, 70 million euros, who, as we discussed on last week's show, was just dropped down from being the joint most viable central defender in the world. He sits 6th on 70 million euros. Victor Osimhen, the Nigerian striker, sits 5th on 75 million euros market value. Sandro Tonali, the Italian midfielder, he's sitting 4th on 80 million euros market value. He's joined by Bryan Mbeumo, the Manchester United forward, on 80 million euros. Khvicha Kvaratskhelia, I can never pronounce his names right. I do apologise to our Georgian listeners. He's sitting 2nd on 90 million euros. And then top of the list is Liverpool and Hungarian midfielder Dominik Szoboszlai on 100 million euros, the star of our recent Premier League market value update. Manu, we can't avoid the fact that there are 4 Italian players on that top 10 list, joined by Rasmus Højlund from Denmark. But maybe we should just pick out a handful of these players that we think would be who will miss the World Cup the most. Now, that's a silly thing to say, obviously, because obviously every player wants to be at the World Cup and every player who misses out wants to miss it. But we at Market Values, at Transfermarkt, obviously focus on the market values of these players. And as we've been discussing on recent shows, the World Cup is such a huge factor when it comes to a player's market value. It can make or break a player's career. It can catapult them into the limelight. And of course, a number of these players perhaps needed it. But let's maybe go, you don't have to go through all 10 players, but is there one in particular that stands out to you as you took that list tonight?
Yeah, I mean, just a real quick correction, Stefan. Šeško is Slovenian, but not so.
My apologies, yeah.
I know that happens really quickly. I just know that there's always going to be that one listener that will complain. So I'm just saying we do know the difference. He obviously does stand out for me, Šeško. although he's still so young, right? And a year off could probably be a good thing for him, or summer off to get better gelled with his Man United teammates. The name that really pops out, really pops out, and we were going through the list a little before the podcast, and we kind of almost simultaneously said it, is Victor Osimhen, isn't it? The Nigerian striker. Every transfer window, he was going to go to have a really big transfer somewhere. He's now at Galatasaray after falling out with Napoli. They made that deal permanent for a huge transfer fee for Turkish football. But he's still kind of always rumored to go somewhere back to one of the top 4 or 5 leagues, right? Go to a big club for a huge transfer fee. For whatever reason, that's just never materialized. But you just know that going to a World Cup, that could have been the catalyst for him, right? To maybe get a desperate club to shell out a 70 to 100 million euro fee to just get this done, right? And now he's not there. And we all know that football clubs, they shouldn't use the World Cup, the small sample size to make signings. The reality is they do. And so, not being in that shopping window, I think, is something that's really going to hurt him.
Yeah, I completely agree. We obviously had Lara Karacan on, who's head of our Turkish team, on the first episode when we talked about the Super League market update, and Osimhen was a huge talking point there. I think everyone in European football, or everyone who follows football around the world and has an interest in European football, has kept one eye on Osimhen at Galatasaray. And Lara's specific point was that he's done absolutely fine at Galatasaray, but he perhaps hasn't done enough to really elevate himself to the point where he's a must-buy for the biggest clubs around the world. And she said we would have to keep an eye on how he did in the Champions League. Obviously didn't get a goal in that second leg against Liverpool. Galatasaray kind of crashed out of the Champions League playoffs, I think they're technically called, or the first knockout round, whatever you want to call it. So, with that in mind, you would think, okay, well, the next, actually perhaps arguably a bigger stage would have been, of course, the World Cup for Osimhen, where maybe not a lot of clubs might have been keeping an eye on his week to week in Turkey, but obviously if Nigeria had been able to make it to the World Cup, then that would have been a perfect platform for him to kind of show what he could do. And that's not going to be the case. So I completely agree with you. It'd be really interesting to see how that maybe impacts him at this summer's World Cup. This summer's transfer window. I think another one as well that, on a similar vein, Manu, is Sandro Tonali, the Newcastle midfielder. He's a really interesting one for me because he's been constantly linked with moves away from Newcastle this season. He's been linked to Manchester United. I think he's been linked with a return to Serie A, although I'm not quite sure who would be able to afford him, because Newcastle would demand a huge fee, and I think maybe Barcelona as well. And there's this kind of growing sense that maybe he feels like he's ready to kind of make the next move after Newcastle. Now, you could maybe argue that his position at Italy is almost quite similar to Newcastle, where he's maybe looking around and thinking, I'm a world-class midfielder here. I should be playing on the biggest stage. And obviously he got to do that in the Champions League for Newcastle this season. But to not be able to do that at the World Cup, I think will be it's a degradation for him, unfortunately. If his ambition or his intention was to obviously put himself in the shop window this summer, then, missing the World Cup is huge for that, because had Italy made it to the World Cup and had he performed, then that would just be another example of why he is considered one of the best kind of central midfielders, best kind of box-to-box midfielders in the world. And he's not going to have that. So, Newcastle fans might be able to kind of rest easy a little bit, thinking, well, he won't be in the shop window. But I think that'd be quite a big blow for the Italian midfielder. While I do admit that I've just probably earned myself the wrath of Newcastle fans by saying all that.
Yeah, and they're definitely an outspoken bunch. So be ready, I guess, for the feedback on social media. Yeah, Tonali is such an interesting case. I do think that players like him have a strong market regardless. And I think maybe it actually hurts Newcastle because they might have to sell to meet financial fair play rules. So it's going to be interesting to see how that impacts him. Staying with Italy, the other one that I think is really fascinating, and he was a tragic hero today, right, is Alessandro Bastoni. He was sent off with a red card. Mind you, it was Donnarumma that put him into that position in the first place. But still, who knows? Maybe in 11-man Italy, no problem, they would have gone through here. As it happened, that wasn't the case. Bastoni was sent off at a point where Italy were still up 1-0 and they conceded late. And now Bastoni's not going to be at the tournament. Bastoni just received a downgrade too. It was one of the topics we spoke with Marius about on last week's episode. And not being at the World Cup, that's gonna be tough, I think, if he does want to have that move to the Premier League, away from Italy. If that is really something he had in his future, I think not being there is going to really hurt him.
Yeah, I completely agree. As you said, we had Marius on last week, and Bastoni was a huge one. And I think what was really interesting was the point that he made that Bastoni's kind of at a stage in his career where he has to basically decide whether he wants to stay put at Inter Milan and become this kind of, not elder statesman, but like this almost like one club man or club legend at Inter, or if he wants to kind of test himself at another level. And I think what Marius was suggesting was that if he wants to do the latter, which is by suggesting that he wants to maybe test himself at another level, that would primarily be because he's almost plateaued at Inter Milan. You know, he's doing perfectly well. He's risen to the level of being one of the most important players, but he's kind of done all he can in Serie A. And certainly for Inter Milan, who, you know, reached Champions League finals and as such. So I do actually wonder if Italy missing the World Cup might accelerate that point of view for him, if indeed it is something that he's considering. And there's a lot of speculation, obviously, over his future. But, you know, we spoke about a few players here who maybe needed the World Cup to earn a move this summer, but Bastoni might be the opposite in the sense that not going to the World Cup might galvanise him to think, right, if I'm not going to play in the highest stage for my national team anytime soon, maybe I have to seek out new experiences and new tests elsewhere, which of course would be, you know, a move to the Premier League or Spain or maybe even like Ligue 1 with PSG, for example. So I think he'd be a huge one, Manu. I think that's definitely one to definitely keep an eye on. And as you said, the fact that he was the man who picked up the red card and inadvertently maybe knocked Italy out of the World Cup is something that won't go unnoticed. And it kind of chimes with what Marius was saying in last week's show, that he's been fine, but he's had some moments where he's maybe kind of looked a little distracted or error prone. And it's just further proof of the fact that he's kind of no longer kind of going from strength to strength into Milan, and maybe he does need to make a move to continue his career and to continue his progress. Another one who stands out to me as well and is also a Serie A star is Rasmus Højlund, the Manchester United player who's obviously on loan at Napoli. If I'm not mistaken, there is a compulsory purchase clause in that deal.
That deal will be permanent.
Yeah, due to whether they qualify for the Champions League or not. I don't know if this really particularly impacts Højlund's immediate future, because it looks like he's doing a perfectly good job in Napoli and he seems to be enjoying himself in Naples. But I think him guiding Denmark to the World Cup would have been a kind of nice kind of, you know, cherry on the cake, if you will, to his kind of comeback story this season, in the sense that he obviously had a very unfortunate time of it in Manchester United. I think whether or not that clause is activated or if it's just a formality, it seems certain to me that A, Napoli want to keep him, and B, Manchester United are probably quite happy to move him on because, you know, the man just 2 spots above him on this list, Benjamin Sesko, has kind of stepped up as the kind of striker for Manchester United, but they obviously have Mateus Cunha and Brian Mbeumo, who is also on this list. So
yeah,
it's a bizarre strong showing for Manchester United here. But I think unfortunately for Højlund, the 2 men above him on this list, and of course Cunha as well, the Brazilian striker, more or less confirms that he doesn't really have a future at Old Trafford, and he will probably almost certainly be staying in Naples next season. But, you know, if Denmark had made it to the World Cup, then I think that would have been a wonderful stage for him. And obviously Denmark have a number of fantastic players and they'll be sorely missed at this World Cup. But Højlund's the only one that makes into that top 10. But is there anyone else on that list, Manu, that you want to touch on?
Well, I don't think it's going to impact their club careers, but Szoboszlai and Kvaratskhelia not being at this stage is sad. Kvaratskhelia in particular is a player I got to see him live a few times last year at the Club World Cup in Seattle. I covered that tournament for Transfermarkt, right? And what a wonderful football player he is. And not being at the tournament, I mean, it's tough, right? He represents Georgia. Wonderful place. I've been there. It's a wonderful place, but unfortunately not a football powerhouse, so they don't qualify for every tournament. I mean, the same is kind of true for Dominik Szoboszlai in Hungary. And that's that's sad, right? Because we want to see the best players at these tournaments, and sometimes, representing these countries can make it harder for them to get there. Although I think the example of Edin Dzeko today showed that there is hope for the Kvaratskhelias and Szoboszlais of this world to be at the World Cup very soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember Szoboszlai and Hungary causing my nation, Scotland, all sorts of grief at the European Championships. So Liverpool fans who are enjoying his kind of one-man show for Liverpool this season, I got a perfect example of that for while I was playing for Hungary a few years ago. But yeah, absolutely spot on. We're talking about, a PSG winger there who could be pushing for the Champions League again this season, and Szoboszlai, who is undoubtedly in the running for perhaps Premier League Player of the Year. Maybe an outsider, because obviously Liverpool aren't going to be winning the Premier League title, but he's definitely been one of the most impressive players in English top flight. So two huge stars that we'll certainly miss. But we'll have to just make do with the rest of them, Manu.
Yeah.
And actually on that talking point, we can maybe kind of move on to the next segment of the show, which is when I sat down with Ben Littlemore and discussed three big players who could see their market values go up or down between now and the end of the season. And I'm happy to say that one of them is a certain German international who played very well for Germany in this international window. I'm sure Manu knows exactly what I'm talking about. But we'll jump straight into that and see how Ben and I got on. So I'm now joined by Ben Littlemore, my colleague on the English team, and of course our Premier League market value coordinator. Ben, we had you on the show earlier in the month when we broke down all the biggest talking points from the Premier League market value update, which came out in the first week of March. And a lot's happened since then. This is exactly why we wanted to get you back on the show and discuss some players who could see some big changes towards the end of the season. We've got one more Premier League market value update before the end of the season. And then, of course, some changes before the World Cup as well. But there's three players I wanted to kind of pick your brains over based on some of the comments we've had in the Market Value Forum. And I think that offers a good opportunity to kind of have a discussion about some players we're keeping an eye on right now. The first one is Adam Wharton, the Crystal Palace midfielder. His market value is at 60 million euros. He didn't get an upgrade in the last market value update, but there's a lot kind of moving around him right now, Ben, as we approach the end of the season. And one of our users gave his thoughts in the forum. I'll just quickly read it out and let you know what he says. He says, he is, alongside Vitinha, the most creative, dynamic playmaker in Europe, plays consistently this season and should be the main target for many top-tier Premier League clubs. He has to go up further. He has continuously performed at this level, and he's playing for a mid-table team. Doesn't make it easier to have the kind of stats that he has. After the World Cup, who could be one of the three best number sixes in the world. Pence09, a huge fan of Adam Wharton on our website, but what's your thoughts on where Wharton is right now, Ben, in terms of his market value and I guess his future, whether or not that's at Crystal Palace?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and certainly one we considered in the last update. Myself, I'm a big fan of the player. I think he's gone a little bit overboard, Pence09, maybe with the three best number sixes in the world, but I think he has the potential to get there. So with Wharton, in the last update, he'd already got a big upgrade earlier in the season to go to 60 million euros. And in the last update, it was a little bit difficult with timing because Crystal Palace were in a pretty bad run of form. They'd been sort of sucked into a relegation battle, which they've now kind of got themselves out of again. And Wharton himself wasn't playing his best football. However, he does have a skill that not many players have in that ability to push passes through the lines and play forward and beat presses now, which is so important to teams. And he is likely to probably get a big move in the summer. However, this is an example of where sometimes Transfermarkt, we're sort of future planning around these updates. So we're not just thinking about the March update when we do it. We're thinking about the fact we have another update in June, and then we have another update after the World Cup as well. So in June, we'll have a better idea of the rumours and exactly what might happen with Adam Wharton this summer. You know, Man United and potentially Manchester City, with rumours Rodri might go, might both be looking for a number 6 in the summer, and you would suggest that Adam Wharton will be quite high on their list. So we'll probably know more about that. We'll know more about potential fees at that stage. So I would say Wharton is one who's probably likely to get an upgrade in June around that. And then obviously we'll know what happens at the World Cup after that. If he goes and starts games for England at the World Cup and has a good World Cup, that value's going to only go up higher because that's going to make him far more aware around the world of what he can do and increase his profile. So yeah, Wharton is definitely one that we will look at again in June and after the World Cup, and he's probably likely to get an upgrade, but March probably came a little bit too soon for him and coincided with his team's poor form and not the best form for himself.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense because, I mean, I'm on his the rumor page on his profile, and the clubs that have so far been linked with the move for him this season: Bayern Munich, Liverpool, Man City, Man United, Real Madrid were the most recent ones linked with him at the start of this week. Discussion about whether if they can't get Rodri at Manchester City, they might turn to Adam Wharton. So there's a lot of speculation, Ben, from a club point of view. But as you said, there's the whole discussion about what he could potentially do for England at this World Cup. But there's also no guarantee that he'll start at this World Cup, especially if Thomas Tuchel's cast of thousands seems to be anything to go by in terms of his recent England squad. So I guess we're kind of on the precipice of maybe Wharton kind of skyrocketing if he gets a big move, if he performs for England at the World Cup. But obviously, at this moment in time, at the end of March or the start of April, it's just speculation at this moment in time, isn't it?
Yeah, like you said, there's a lot of ifs. And I think in this England starting 11 going into the World Cup, that's one of the positions that's essentially up for grabs. We all know Declan Rice is going to start in midfield. It's probably likely to be Jude Bellingham beside him. But that I think Rice will probably play in that number 8 role. And then it's that more deep line midfielder that's going to play alongside him. We've already learned in the last year that Thomas Tuchel is a big fan of Elliot Anderson, and he has probably played the most in that position alongside Rice. So he's probably the favourite to start that position. But there is a lot of calls for Adam Wharton because I think he would benefit Rice in terms of their profiles. What Rice struggles with, Wharton excels in terms of passing forward between the lines. And I think it would give Rice that licence to drive on as well. So it is something that could potentially work. But as you say, it's a big if at the moment, and we'll know if that's an actual position that he's going to nail down in the summer, and that will affect his market value accordingly.
Another midfielder who I wanted to touch on because there's been some discussion about him in the forum, and I think it's probably a really interesting player to touch on at this moment in time of the season, is Mateus Fernandes at West Ham. One of the users in the forum simply put, he's West Ham's best current player, and he suggests a market value increase. His market values currently stand at 35 million euros, Ben. We did upgrade him by 3 million euros in the last Premier League market value update. But I think Fernandes is an interesting one because, as I just said, he is West Ham's best player right now, but he's kind of characterising this impressive kind of turn in form for West Ham in the second half of the season. But he's also a player who joined for a huge fee at the start of the season. So he kind of had that hanging over him. But it feels like he's maybe finally settled into that West Ham team, and West Ham are beginning to benefit from it.
For sure. And then again, that was probably one of the most difficult players to assess in the last update. And maybe one we did make a slight mistake with. We could have perhaps gone a little bit higher to potentially to 40 million. And I don't particularly disagree that he's been West Ham's best player. I think Crescencio Somerville has also been excellent before he got injured. But those two are the ones that are carrying that charge at the moment to try and get West Ham out of that. However, they are still in the relegation zone at the moment and are probably the favourites out of that battle to go down. So it was a difficult one in that last update, bearing in mind he'd already gone up 20 million over the season. So we chose to only go 3 million up further in the March update. But there's no doubt that he's been excelling because of the exit of Lucas Paqueta. That left a huge hole in that team in terms of creativity in midfield, and he has stepped up and taken that role. And I think Paqueta's attitude was perhaps having a bit of a bad effect on the squad in terms of, for a while, we've known he's not particularly happy there. So without him, Fernandes has stood up and sort of made that role his own in the team. And he has been fantastic. And as I say, if they stay up, it's likely to be through him. And if they go down, there's likely to be a lot of interest from other Premier League clubs to try and perhaps get him on a cheaper fee, with West Ham being relegated. So I think, yeah, he's definitely someone we'll have in mind for another upgrade in June, and someone who was perhaps a little bit unlucky to not go up further in the last update.
Yeah, he's another one who I think could benefit from a good World Cup. He got a call up to the Portuguese national team. It was on the bench against Mexico, didn't come on. But if you actually look at the midfielders they've obviously got some outstanding midfielders. Vitinha's the most obvious one. But, in that game, it was Ruben Neves, who's obviously Al Hilal, whose kind of stock is beginning to stumble, and Samu Costa, who's playing for Mallorca. So you would think if Fernandes can continue performing in the Premier League, it's something that Roberto Martinez is obviously aware of, and we might see his market value increase there as well. It's also just another example, and we do kind of make this point as often as we can. We don't line up transfer fees one for one with the market values, do we? They obviously play an influence in it, but Fernandes kind of had to prove not that he was a 44 million euro player at West Ham, but that he was a West Ham player first and foremost, didn't he, this season? And I guess we could argue that he's now beginning to show that.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, the further towards the end of the transfer window we often see clubs particularly clubs who've had a bad start to the season, panic buying to an extent. and overpaying for players. And with Fernandes, he didn't start great at West Ham, and it looked like he might have been one of those. So I think his market value was 15 million at the time when he went for 44 million, which was obviously too low. I think we amended that straight away to 32 million in the next update because he didn't start great at West Ham. And since then, he has improved, as I said, so he's likely to go up further. With the World Cup, I just can't see him getting anywhere near the lineup through no fault of his own, just through the sheer number. Portugal's midfield is so scary when you've got Vitinha, João Neves, Bernardo Silva, and Martinez obviously likes the experience of Ruben Neves. I think Fernandes might go and he might get some minutes, which accordingly could still affect his market value, but I think he's unlikely to be able to get in that starting midfield just yet because of the sheer quality they have. But he's still only 21 years old as well, so definitely one for the future for both Portugal and for potentially a top Premier League club.
Yeah, absolutely. The last name on this list is a contentious one. He's a player who everyone seems to be discussing right now, and that's why I wanted to bring him up on the show, and that's, of course, Florian Wirtz at Liverpool. He was 140 million euros at the start of the summer. Start of the season, he's now 110. And we had one user make an interesting point here, Ben. He says, Wirtz is already on 15 goals and assists this season. There's another 10 or 15 games left for Liverpool. So we could see a player here who maybe does kind of get into double figures, or more, sorry, double figures, 20 plus maybe goals and assists for Liverpool. And maybe a bit like Fernandes, as we just discussed there, a player who kind of had that kind of huge transfer fee kind of hanging around his neck. We've almost came out the back of that now where people thought, right, okay, that kind of discussion about his transfer fees come and gone. And he's maybe now beginning to perform a little bit for Liverpool, begin to show the player that he was at Leverkusen, and obviously why Liverpool decided to sign him in the first place.
Yeah, so I watched the highlights of the game against Switzerland, and it was a fantastic performance based on the assists and goals he got. He looked like he was fantastic. I actually think I'd probably go the other way and think he was, if anything, lucky to hold on to his value again. Just purely because, like you say, he's got 14 goals and assists for the season, but he's played 40 games. He's only got 6 goals. You know, some of those assists have essentially just been passing the ball to someone, Salah on the edge of the box, and he's curled it in the corner. I think his performances have dropped slightly since he came back from that back injury. I thought he was really poor against Tottenham and Brighton in the draw and defeat against those sides. I think he has just 1 assist in his last 8 games in all competitions, which was that pass to Salah at the edge of the box against Galatasaray. So in terms of, he's still the 4th most valuable player in the entire Premier League as well. So I don't think he's doing enough to be getting an upgrade at all. And I think he's just about doing enough to hang on to the value he currently has. He obviously is a fantastic talent, but I think he's still adapting to the Premier League. He looks more comfortable in a Germany shirt, as we saw, I think it was last Friday against Switzerland. So for me, I think he'd have to have a fantastic end to the season and sort of drive Liverpool on towards trophies in either the FA Cup or the Champions League to get to be considered for an upgrade in June. And then if he has a fantastic World Cup with Germany, we can consider that again after the World Cup. But I think 110 million is more than fair right now for Wirtz. And I think, yeah, as I say, he'd have to have a fantastic end to the season, which he's definitely capable of doing if he goes on and smashes against PSG in the quarterfinals, steals the show, and has a great end to the Premier League season. There's no reason why he can't go up again. But I think right now, yeah, he'd really have to up his game to be looking at another upgrade.
Yeah, Liverpool, of course, still competing for that 5th Champions League spot. They might, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did catch Aston Villa, considering the form of Aston Villa right now. So,
Chelsea
Liverpool, yeah, Chelsea as well. So Liverpool could kind of have a decent end to the campaign. But one thing I actually did want to touch on, which obviously happened after the Premier League market update, was, of course, Mohamed Salah's decision to leave Liverpool and the club's decision to kind of let him go, that kind of mutual agreement. That's something that should play into Wirtz's favour next season where, as you said, so much of Liverpool's play obviously goes around Mohamed Salah, still does. He's the kind of centre of gravity there. If you look at how Wirtz plays for Germany and how he plays for Liverpool, at Germany, he's the man that the ball goes to. He's the guy who's expected to score the goals on the edge of the box, pick out the passes. But at Liverpool, he's like the guy before that, isn't he? He's the guy who's still facilitating Salah, whereas next season that could change and he could become for Liverpool what he already is for Germany, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. I think, like you say, I think Salah leaving probably will benefit him in terms of that hierarchical decision to get the ball to those further forward players. Because, like as you say, a lot goes through Salah. Salah doesn't particularly track back and has a bit of a free roam to sort of do what he wants, and quite justifiably so, considering what he's done for the club over the last decade or so. What I would say as well, though, is we've seen Szoboszlai in that midfield really step up this season alongside Salah, and when Salah's been out of the team and demand the ball and affect games, whereas we haven't really seen Wirtz do that over a consistent basis. So maybe that's someone Wirtz can look at. But I think we also have to remember, as we've mentioned many times before, like it's his first season in the Premier League. We don't see many players come to the Premier League and just smash it straight away. It's a different kettle of fish when it comes to the physicality of it and the intensity of it and the difficulty of every game. I mean, you look at Wolves. Going to Wolves away right now is a tough game. They're bottom of the league with 13 points. So I think he's still adapting to that. And I think with Salah moving on next season, I think Liverpool fans will be hoping that's when we see the best of Florian Wirtz. And hopefully, if that happens, his market value can shoot back up as well.
Yeah, all to play for sure, but definitely a lot of kind of moving factors at Liverpool. It'd be interesting to see where Wirtz and Liverpool are standing when we discuss this at the end of the season. But Ben, I'm going to let you go. Used up more than enough of your time. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And if you guys are enjoying this conversation and you'd like to take part in it, make sure you head over to Transfermarkt, click on forum, head to market value analysis, and you'll see a plethora of options to discuss any specific player you want. And as I've said on previous shows, we'll definitely look to try and feature these and have these discussions going forward. So I'll hopefully be able to drag Ben back on the show when we get some interesting comments. But for now, Ben, thank you so much, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
I'm now joined by my French colleague, Ronald Karoff, who is our area manager for France. Ronald, it was a big day at the end of last week as we broke down the latest market value update for Ligue 1. There's so much to discuss in Ligue 1. There's so many fantastic players, so many exciting teams. From a UK point of view, it feels like we now spend all summer kind of looking through the league to see which clubs are going to sign which players, and we will get onto that towards the end of our discussion. But I think we have to start this topic with Jeremy Jacquet, the young defender who joined Liverpool in January, and he recently had a market value upgrade. He went from 20 million euros to 55 million euros, which is a huge upgrade. Do you want to maybe explain the reasoning behind that upgrade? Obviously, he's moved to Liverpool, but I'm sure there's more to it than that as well.
Hi, Stefan. I'm glad to be here on this podcast. Yeah, of course, because Jeremy Jacquet is by far the biggest rise of this update, I think by more than 20 million above the highest other raise in this update in Ligue 1. And of course, we saw the potential of this player early this season. He played a rather important role in the defense of Stade Rennais, but it's been almost his first complete season as a professional in Ligue 1, because almost a year ago, he was just a player on loan in the second tier in France, in Clermont. So it was quite a fast rise to fame and to a higher level for him. So it was a bit tough to judge. Even last winter, I think we went from 10 or 12 million euros to 20. And despite all the noise that was already around him, like we know he will be a topic in this winter transfer window, but we couldn't expect this a bit of a bidding war, because of course he went to stand with Liverpool, but it wasn't the only club interested. It probably that played also a part in the final fee that got around him that could rise, I think, with a bonus above 70 million euros. So that's really impressive also for a French defender. Even if we know it's a really trendy type of players, especially for English teams, that was a great surprise to see him rise this much in interest for other clubs in Europe. And so, of course, we need to match or get close to match the fee that he was paid for, which was around 63 something million euros. So we decided to go with 55 million for this update, because, like I said, of course, we see a lot of his potential, and around the last season he played, we see the level he could achieve, but it's also just one full season of professional football at the highest level. And one could argue that between Stade Rennais, who hasn't been in European competition for the past few seasons, compared to one of the greats of Europe like Liverpool, there's also a further step that needs to be made. So we would wait to see how he would adapt to this next step, to maybe see if we need to reach completely this fee or pass it in the next months, even if that will be the UK team issue then. But yeah. But of course, we also know that since almost a month ago already, he got a shoulder injury against Lens, and for a few weeks they were wondering if he could really heal from it. But now he will go to. Has been said that he will go to surgery, so it's almost sure that his season will be over, or it will be like a comeback in early March. And would it make sense for him to come back just for the last couple of games and risk another injury? Or probably Liverpool would rather want for him to be really save, preserve him for the next season with Liverpool and have him in the best of conditions for a clean start with his new club.
Yeah, you certainly wouldn't want to rush him back from injury too soon. There's an interesting parallel here to Lenny Yoro, who made the move to Manchester United for just slightly less money. It's only a few million euros in it. He hasn't really quite got going at Manchester United just yet. Maybe not all his fault. There's obviously been a lot of turnover with managers and players, and Manchester United have only really just started playing well in the last maybe 2 or 3 months. So a lot of factors outside of his control. But some people may question whether Liverpool have spent a lot of money on a young defender who doesn't have a huge amount of experience at senior level, and may look to draw comparisons to Lenny Yoro in sense of saying, well, they spent a lot of money on a player with a lot of potential, but is Jacquet ready to play in the Premier League for Liverpool next season, assuming he gets over his shoulder injury? But of course, Ronald, you've watched a lot of him this season. What have you made of his performances before he got injured? And do you think he has that potential to be a star for Liverpool and to live up to that transfer fee?
In a way, I see the comparison with Euro, but it's also not really the same case because Euro really exploded at a really young age. I think he started for Lille around 16 years old. While in this modern football era, Jacquet is almost a late bloomer, like he's around 20 years old, and we really saw him arrive since barely a year. So it's Jacquet had a bit of more years to perfect his craft in the academies and not have the spotlight on him so soon. So, but indeed, from what I could see, and I say this, I'm a fan of Stade Rennais, so I've got to see him up close in a few games this season at the stadium. And from what I saw, he's been really an interesting player. Even if we know players from this age, we can always find things that will need amelioration and a few other things like that. But he's been really well composed in defense. And for the past the start of the season, Ryan was playing with a back three in defense, and it was quite a rather stable composition around him. But it was, I think, the most used of these three centre backs, and we don't really see the fact that he's only a 19, 20-year-old player when we saw him defend. But it's a player that has a great vision of the game. He's because like when we see his height, for example, we could think, oh, he's just a basic type of centre back who would be great for headers or a few things like that. But he has a lot more qualities. Like I said, great vision of the game. He's not so static in his area. He can really progress a few meters with the ball to relaunch an action for his side. So he's I think he's much more for his team that what is just like what his CV will say with his height or a few performances. Like when we see him on the pitch, we see he's much more than just a classic centre back. I think we could also almost imagine from what his qualities are that in some aspects we could see him use at some point like a defensive midfielder and number 6, depending on what Liverpool wants to play. But yes, indeed, I see the English point of view that Euro hasn't really proven himself in Manchester United after almost 2 years now, 1 year and a half, 2 years of joining the Premier League. But I think it will be a bit tough to judge for Jacquet in the few first months because it will be only third club because he's had his half season in loan in Ligue 2 and now around a full season between 2 seasons in Ligue 1, and now he will have to jump into an higher level with European competitions. That will also be a first for him. So I think there is a lot of factors that makes it tough to really assess what will be the use of Jacquet in the first months in Liverpool. But let's hope that the fee around him and the rising value that he just had will not weigh too much on his shoulder. But we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. Some really interesting insight there. I hadn't even considered the possibility of him playing in midfield or as a defensive midfielder, but I'm sure that will come as welcome news to Liverpool fans. Another young player who had an impressive market value increase in the latest market value update was Endrick, the Brazilian forward who's on loan from Real Madrid at Olympique Lyon. His market value rose from 25 million euros to 35 million euros. Ronald, we were just discussing before we started recording here, this is his first market value increase since summer 2024 when he was still at Palmeiras in Brazil. Endrick's such an interesting player. He's obviously a player that a lot of people around the world are very interested in. Any Brazilian player who moves to Real Madrid obviously garners huge appeal around the world. And I think a lot of people, especially Real Madrid fans, will be happy to hear that he maybe has kind of turned things around and seems to be thriving at Lyon in 2026.
Yeah, it was like an earthquake in the French transfer window this winter to see a name like Endrick arrive, because of course we know the talent of Ligue 1 and the many potential of players we see in this league, but it's often like homegrown players and we don't attract as much foreign talents. So seeing a player like him arrive in Lyon, I think it was a lot of great potential to see, because we know he's still young and he's been spotted by a team like Real Madrid. Even if it didn't really quite work out there yet, we know that in the right environment, there is a possibility to show himself in a better light. And so far, in the first three something months that he got to play for Lyon, he really managed to rise back to this, at least some standard that we would hope of such a talent, compared to his start of the season with Real Madrid, when he played probably almost like 90 minutes across 3 games. Like it was almost could almost have doubts of his capacity to adapt to a team at the middle of a season with so little playing time before. But he's been really great, especially in the first few weeks he had, I would say, with like even a hat trick in his second Ligue 1 game, and in a great period for Lyon in like January and February, especially when there were and a lot of wins in a row. And even if in the more recent weeks and games, we got to see a bit more of the other side of Endrick with some frustration or some choice, would say, what do we say, like personal choices, like he would miss the good pass at the good time or be too personal in some actions. But I guess it's sometimes in the nature of the player, but some of his choices still manage to create some great goal opportunities, and he actually has a rather nice balance with Lyon, with 6 goals and 5 assists. So it's not too personal. Like there is still some great connections with players around him. Like as I've seen on social networks, Brazilian fans praise some Lyon players with how well or smooth the transitions were with Endrick in some plays. So I think it seems to be quite a great environment for him, and it's also been proven by the fact that he's been called again with the Brazil national team for this March international window, which will be the last before the World Cup. So I think he's just found a great opportunity at the right time to really put himself back on the map in a way, and that a great half season in France that will hopefully reach European places. Like Lyon is 4th right now, I think, in Ligue 1, so it's really close to the Champions League places. So if he manage to help to bring this team in Champions League and then jumps on the Brazilian roster for the World Cup, I think he will have brought himself back to a high level, and then it will be up to Madrid to think how they want to assess these players, because we know that with the managerial situation in Real Madrid, they probably will change again the organization next summer. So how will the next coach want to include Endrick, which type of position, or do they think he will require another full season on loan in Lyon or somewhere else to really gather some more playing time or stuff like that? I think it will be quite interesting to see in the next few months how Endrick will evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I've noticed, which is quite interesting, is that he's played on that right wing in some games, which is, of course, where Ryan Cherki played last season for maybe not all the time, but sometimes for Lyon. Do you think he's benefited from maybe stepping into a hole in that Lyon team left behind by Cherki? Does he perhaps even bring that kind of star quality that Cherki had beforehand last season?
Yeah, he has proven these few months in Lyon to be a bit more versatile that we would expect from him, and there has been a few gaps to fill in this team actually, because they've suffered a few injuries. Like we know the potential of players like Malik Fofana, the Belgian winger, and also Ernest Nuama, who is on the other side. Who both these wingers got really long injuries last season, which they are barely coming back from. So Lyon really needed to fill these gaps, and it's like it wasn't just an opportunity that will steal a spot in the roster. Like Lyon actually quite needed this type of players to fill this gap, because like we know the troubles they had with the owner John Textor and the Eagle Football Group last summer, that they were in the risk of relegation. So they didn't have the best transfer window last summer, and probably couldn't build the attack that they want. And now seeing a talent like Endrick enter this roster and offer a lot of possibilities on a various positions, I think has been quite a relief for the coach Paulo Fonseca also to see a player of his stature to bring a bit more, I wouldn't say talent, because of course a team like Lyon always has talent, but a bit more aura in a way. Like if you go to other football fans, they tell them about Afonso Moreira, Malik Fofana, Ernest Nuama, they wouldn't know about them yet. But you mentioned Endrick, that he will be the next Cherki in this team. It will click a lot more with people also, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it'll be very interesting to see how he does for the rest of the season, and of course what happens to him next season, because as you mentioned, every chance that he could feature for Brazil at the World Cup after a very strong second half of the season with Lyon. Ronald, before we let you go, I wanted to touch on a really interesting article your colleague Akeem wrote based around this market value update, and the discussion you and the French team had about the need to maybe raise the market values of a lot of players in the league based on this kind of rush of transfer fees that have come in recent years. You guys obviously focused on the top 10 transfer fees in the winter transfer window, or the January transfer window, as it's sometimes called. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though the demand for Ligue 1 players in recent years seems to got to such a point that it's outpacing how quickly you guys can push up the market values of players like Jacquet, or maybe even Cherki last season. Do you want to just quickly speak to that and how you guys are working very hard in the background to keep up with the real life movements of these players?
It's been quite hard, I think, for the last few seasons, because it's not such a new phenomenon to see the race for French talents in foreign teams to try to attract these players. We saw some bidding wars, and not even like sometimes for French players, but for foreign talents that got their first step to fame in Ligue 1. Like we saw a player like Kusanov last season, who barely after a half season as starter in Lens went to Manchester City for around 40 million euros, which was quite higher than the value we had at the time. And we've seen this type of phenomenon happen again last summer and this winter again, with a lot of transfers that had gaps of maybe at least around 10 million between the fee that was spent by the buying club and the value that we had estimated at the time. So it was a bit of a turning point for us to think, well, in a way, we don't want to follow too blindly the hype, but the hype is becoming like systematic in a way. We know that for a French talent that is starting to really show himself in a good light in Ligue 1, he will attract more important teams in Europe, or even in France, like PSG or Marseille, Lyon could be interested in some of these players and will be ready to spend some high fees on them, or higher fees than what we will value usually this type of talents who have 18, 19, 17-year-olds and maybe half a season behind them. But now teams, they will see the potential of the player, and no matter the experience that the player has or not, they will think we will need to rather sign him now at a possibly lower fee, even if it's quite high in a way, rather than waiting for another club to buy him and buy him back like 50, 60 million euros 2 years later. So I think it's a bit of a phenomenon of anticipation in a way, and it's not even like we've seen Jacquet goes to Liverpool, so it's a Premier League club. We know most of Premier League club can invest a lot on players, but we've seen like some players of Ligue 1 went to Saudi Arabia. We have a talent from Marseille, Robinho Vaz, who went to Roma in Italy. Sidiki Sheriff, who is from the team of Angers, with a quite modest team, will have his buying option of a loan activated to Fenerbahce around 20 million. So even teams in Turkey can invest this type of money also on French talents. So I think we needed to catch up on this phenomenon and hope to show in a way more realistic light the current state of the French market for talents, even if it's sometimes a bit tough still to wrap our heads around the type of fees that are getting spent on some players. But it is what it is now.
It is what it is. That's a good way of putting it. Football is a world into its own. Do you think that's maybe, how do you explain this incredible rise in interest for French talents? Now, obviously you can say France has always made good players, but so has Spain, so has, Brazil, so has Croatia. Lots of countries have developed lots of good players. Is it just a case that France is doing it, is producing more good players at this moment in time? Or is there some sort of economic factor behind it that means that clubs are more willing to do transfer deals with French clubs at this moment in time?
I think it's a bit of both, because we all know the quality of French academies, like a lot of professional club and even some lesser known club in France can produce great young talents. But I think it's also that there has been some troubles in France in the past few years with like TV rights and a few other things that got some more modest teams in a tougher financial situation. So if they can't buy talented players, promising players for their own roster, they need to focus on the academy and try to bring up some talents from their home turf, and in that way it makes a great better interest for these players, because in other leagues, bit more financially stable leagues, this type of young players will get a more calm path to the first team, maybe a loan to a middle table team or a second tier team. But now some teams in Ligue 1 the sooner they spot a young talent is under 19, under 17 or the reserve team, they will try as soon as possible to offer him some chances in the first team, because in a way that's also the perfect pathway to show them more to the football world and hope to get a fee. Like some players, I think we've seen Brian Madro is a forward who joined Aston Villa this winter from SMS, who had a few games really early this season, and is like born in 2009 or something like that. He's really young player, and the next few months he didn't appear as much, but he just needed these few first games to be on the radar of some teams, and he's joined Aston Villa for at least around 10 million, I think. So it's been, I think now French teams, especially the ones that really need this type of money that really promising transfers can offer them, will also seize the opportunity every chance they get when they have a young talent or prospect coming up the ranks to give him the necessary minutes to put him on the radar of bigger teams, even if it means that these players will spend less time at their home club and the fans will not get to enjoy them so much. But I think it's a way for the French football economic system to work now, is also to help to value this player more by showing them more and sooner in a great light on the pitch, and get some throw-in clubs to get a better view of them the sooner they can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if we see even more names this summer being linked to all sorts of clubs, particularly in the Premier League as well. So, Ronan, we'll definitely have you back on very soon to discuss all that. I'm sure we'll be discussing many, many, many more young players moving to England in the coming months. But until then, thank you so much for coming on. And of course, anyone who wants to read all of Ronan's great work, you can find the Market Value Update article on all English domains, or if you prefer to read it in French, you can find it in the French domain as well. And if you just want to have a look through the work that Ronan and his team have done, head to the Ligue 1 page and click on market values in the menu, and that'll give you a breakdown of everything. But Ronan, thank you so much, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you too. Bye.